slipped up, or maybe even out of a time of spiritual deadness or rebellion, we did something that we regret. I know some of the ones that burn within me are frequently things that I said as a child or youth, or even in my adult years, that you wish you could take back. That those words that escape, that you wish you could somehow suck them back in or erase people's memory that might remember them, or even your own memory. We don't have that privilege of erasing. Once something is said, it is said forever. So James is particularly concerned with us having a clear conscience in these matters. And James says that there's a lot of things that we stumble into. We have a lot of faults. We have all kinds of different habits of sin or weaknesses. And he says all those are hard enough, but the hardest one perhaps, or at least one of the hardest ones, is that of controlling our tongue, of saying words that are edifying or building up. Remember, one of my most regretful moments was I had a best friend growing up who I think was always kind to me. I can't judge his heart, but it always seemed like my friend Ken was kind to me. And I wasn't always kind in return. In fact, I was competitive and ill-tempered sometimes, a short temper. And I remember at least a couple of times that I got angry and I said harsh words that probably I didn't even mean at the moment, but who knows where things come from that plague of our heart. And I wish I could take this back. My friend Ken was killed in an automobile accident about 11 or 12 years ago now, and we had many good times since then, and I don't think he held it against me for the rest of his life. We actually roomed together in college, and I think we got along pretty well, but I wish that I could retrieve those hard words, those harsh words, but you can't. But what you can do is learn from your mistakes and learn from your faults and be admonished that now and into the future, to be careful with the tendency to use harsh words. And of course, harsh words are probably a danger anytime, but it does seem to be it's the hardest among brothers. There's something about family, there's something about people that are close, maybe even best friends, that maybe we feel more free, maybe we feel more hurt when something happens that offends us, that especially among brothers. And James is writing to people that clearly are having some conflict among the family of God. And it's pretty obvious that he's addressing people that are having trouble getting along well, and especially speaking well to each other. So last week we began looking at his challenge of controlling our words, of not being too eager to be teachers, which of course is humbling for those of us that speak in public for a living. That's always something to call us up short and to do self-examination. But I think James is not only interested in those that speak in public, but those that speak in private and in community with other people, whether it's at the family of home or whether it's in the family of the church. That James is concerned that people speak well. We started looking at that last week, and the difficulty, he says, one of the hardest things in the world is to control your tongue. And I think his point is not to discourage us, but to urge us to apply effort, to realize that this is a serious problem, and the damage could be very great. And it's going to require some discipline. It's going to require some attention to it. So he says that mankind has tamed all kinds of wild beasts and creatures. And if you can imagine how much training you would need, how much practice you would need, little by little, getting more adept with that. If you can imagine how much discipline it would take and courage it would take to tame a lion, tiger. James says, use that kind of approach to taming your tongue, your words. But we pick up on that as we continue in James chapter 3. We're going to be looking at verses 8 through 12, which is really the point of the previous these verses. That the reason he mentions how hard it is to tame the tongue is because of what he says next. So if you could follow along in your copy of God's Word, beginning in James 3, verse number 8. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh. So James is addressing, in the problem of speech, and particularly harsh words towards brothers. Harsh words that have wounded, that hurt, that hinder relationships. And James is concerned that his church get a handle on their tongue, because it's a part of respecting other people, of getting along well. And here he comes back to his theme of religious duplicity. Saying one thing and then contradicting it with another. It's one of the James actually repeated theme in his book. A religious hypocrisy of making claims with one's words before God, but not following through with a similar kind of thing with relationships with other people. And here is one of the key texts on that whole dilemma of treating our religious life one way and our social life, our relationship with others, in a different way. So the problem of harsh words among brethren is a subject. This isn't the first time he's brought up this subject of words, as we saw last week. In chapter 1, he says, so then, in verse 19, so then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. So you see that right from the beginning, James is thinking about challenging his church and you with the problem of words of anger. Slow to speak, swift to hear, slow to speak, and then the thing that produces hard speech, anger, slow to wrath. And then again in verse 26, if anyone among you thinks he is religious, notice that that expression of profession, a profession of religiosity. In chapter 2, he mentions about the profession of faith that doesn't produce any works. He questions that. So that correlation of what one professes with one's mouth and what one does with one's life, one's actions, and especially one's words. If anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. He's reflecting on, James has a lot of similar themes and actually phrases as the wisdom literature in the Old Testament. We're thinking of particularly the books of Job and Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Those are considered the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. You know, what is wisdom? The successful living of God's principles and the realities of life. Psalm 15 talks about the righteous man, or the man that God particularly honors. Is he who does not backbite with his tongue. What God's looking for is someone whose tongue does not bite back at others, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend. So God is concerned with the righteous man. He's proud of the righteous man. He blesses the righteous man who speaks well, and especially speaks well in relationship to the people around him. So the wisdom books warn about kind of harsh words. In Proverbs 12:18 we read, there is one who speaks like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise promotes health. So that contrast between the wise and the foolish. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to look at, James is going to bring up that very idea of who's wise and who is foolish. We'll look at that next week, but he gets a lot of that from Proverbs. It says the wise man is one who the foolish one speaks like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise promotes health. Proverbs 10:19 through 21, in the multitude of words sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise. Of course, the point here is not just to speak few words. It's possible to do a lot of damage with few words. The point is to have measured words, thought out words, carefully, strategically used words. So maybe the less the better, but maybe the thought is the more thoughtful the better. The tongue of the righteous is choice silver. The heart of the wicked is worth little. These Hebrew parallelisms sometimes are, frequently we'll say the same thing twice. or say something similar but in opposition. So here you get this kind of contrast of the righteous with the wicked. The righteous, the tongue, where the wicked's the heart. He's not really saying, like only thinking about the tongue of the wise. He's talking about the heart of the wise. He's not just thinking about the heart of the wicked. He's talking about the words of the wicked that are expressions of the heart. So the tongue of the righteous is choice silver, along with the heart that produces it. And the heart of the wicked is worth little, just like the words that they say. Verse 21, the lips of the righteous feed many. Wouldn't it be great if your words fed people, if people were encouraged, they were stronger, they were more vibrant because of your words, they went away feeling more enthusiastic about their life. And words feed, words can bless, can build up. The lips of the righteous feed many, but fools die for the lack of wisdom. And the thought is that there's just not, there's not a good speech, and it caused death, caused perishing. Jesus, of course, picks up on this in one of the more famous and demanding texts in Matthew chapter 5, where he compares the standard of the way that the Pharisees might have read the Old Testament, kind of in a wooden literalness that managed to cut off all the real problems that you might have. So, they were saying, well, we've never murdered anybody, and Jesus is like, you not really understand the command if all you think is God only is concerned about physical killing. So in Matthew 5:21, Jesus said, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of the judgment. So Jesus is saying, the sixth commandment about murder isn't only about the actual literal taking of life, but it's about respecting the image of God in every way. So even the one that's angry without cause will be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raka, or cursed, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. So those harsher judgment, kind of just insulting kind of words, Jesus says, you'll be judged for those. So James wants to bring to our attention a certain absurdity of one kind of speech from a mouth that doesn't fit with another kind of speech. So if we look at James chapter 3 again, we see in verse number 9, with it, that is with the tongue, with our mouth, with our words, we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh. So James says, he's this master of analogies. I don't know how many we've seen here. There's already been a dozen or so of these famous analogies that James loves to kind of bring a picturesque view of his teaching. So the thought of a spring. You come to a spring, maybe you're searching like Ponce de Leon for the fountain of youth. And you come to this fountain, and sometimes when you drink it, it's just fresh and alive with the refreshment of water, and you feel like it's making you more alive. And then the next time you come, you drink, and it's bitter, and there's some poison in it, and you're going to die from it. And James says this is absurd. That this pool, this spring of water, can't have this mix of thing. Or some tree that produces a fruit. It doesn't sometimes produce one kind of fruit and then the next day produce another kind. There's some absurdity of the natural order. And so James he's kind of wondering about this church that he's associated with, that he goes to their services and their singing is so sweet and their prayers are just eloquent and blessing God. And it's like music to your ears to hear these people talk about God. And then in the foyer, after church, there's this squabbling and there's squawking and there's these insults and this thing going on. And James is like, how can this be? How can you have this absurdity of a mixed fountain? On the one hand, these sweet and respectful words about God, and on the other hand, biting, hard, bitter words about his image bearers, the people that are made in the image of God. And James is urging these people to fear this kind of duplicity, to wonder what could be going on here. Is it possible that there's a hypocrisy, that there's a faking of a praise of God, a portrayal of something that says we're right with God, but maybe reality, maybe life among brothers reveals something more sinister about us. Now, what are we like at home? What are we like on the job? I suppose anybody can come to church and speak well. It's only a couple hours a week and every reason, every incentive to sound and look good, and there's nothing wrong with that. Unless, of course, it's combined with some other, some kind of alternate life that reveals there's a facade, there's some kind of mask being put on that is taken off in some other environments. And James says we should really fear that. And he's driving us to examine ourselves. It's one of the themes of every passage of Scripture, especially these exhortations, to examine ourselves, to use our self-reflection abilities. We have the ability to kind of step outside of ourselves and view ourselves as is from a distance, and to be self-critical. And James is urging that, just like so many of the texts of the Bible do encourage us to be self-critical. And here he's urging us to examine, how can this be? He says, how can these things be? How can you have fresh water and bitter water out of the same mouth, out of the same spring? There's something wrong there that requires self-examination, that requires an evaluation of oneself. So, while James keeps talking about the tongue and bridling the tongue and controlling, taming the tongue, pretty clear the problem is not with the mechanics of our vocal cords and our enunciation with tongues. Pretty clear the problem isn't with proper grammar or our vocabulary is insufficient. The problem is from our heart, and we know that from many biblical texts. And next week, as we look about the wisdom, where these kind of words come from, which kind of wisdom it is, we'll see that he's asking us to examine the root of our words. What spirit do these words come from? Where is the heart? Jesus mentions or teaches that it's not what goes into a man's mouth that defiles him, it's what comes out of his mouth. It's the words that defile him. And Jesus says, because it's out of the overflow of one's heart that the mouth speaks. The overflow of one's attitudes, the disposition of what's going on in the heart, that really is where the guilt comes from. Jesus says, for out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. But to eat, even with unwashed hands, as gross as that might seem to us, does not defile a man. It's what comes from our heart. But James has already indicated, and this is no surprise in the Bible, and if you have grown at all spiritually, you know it's true. We have a problem of self-deception. Our heart is sneaky. Jeremiah says that the heart is desperately wicked. Who can know it? Jeremiah 17, verse 9. The heart even deceives the person that the heart belongs to. In contemporary language, heart frequently means emotions, which is totally inadequate for a biblical understanding. Well, heart includes emotions. It's pretty clear the heart is much more than emotions. You can tell that just by the fact that you make judgments about your emotions. There's something deeper than your emotions, right? When you're angry, there's something that can evaluate your anger. When you're happy, you're like, I'm glad I'm happy. Or if you're sad, you're like, oh, I'm sad that I'm sad. There's something deeper than emotions. And that's what the Bible is addressing, that thing behind the emotions, that center of our being. But the problem with us as sinners is that our hearts are very tricky and very hard to know. That they're slippery, and they're better than the most clever lawyer that can trap you and deceive you. Their hearts are very good that way. And I don't know, I'm sure if you've walked with the Lord, but I see it in myself. I know there's been a number of times in my life that I think, I'm not even sure I know what I meant. Lisa and I have a, maybe a disagreement, happened once or twice in our marriage, that I might say something that hurts, and I'll think, what did I mean by that? And I don't always know. One of my least favorite moments in my pastoral ministry here was, I don't know, a few years after coming here, and we had a Sunday school class with a guest speaker, and the speaker had some people in the church, and I forget exactly what the point was. It was something about missions, and I made a joke. I thought it was a joke, and I really hurt this one family's feelings, and then other families were hurt because that family was hurt. And I just kind of was like, I was so confused. I was like, I thought I was making an innocent joke, and I could not for the life of me remember what my motivation was. I tried and tried and tried. I thought all day long, I thought all week long. What in the world was I could not get back. And I thought about it, it's been 20 years. I've thought about it every year since then. I cannot remember. I don't even know. I don't think I meant something, but I went to that family and met them the next day. I went to the other families that I knew were hurt by it and apologized. And whether I meant something or not, it didn't matter. I hurt somebody's feelings, and that was wrong. But that just kind of indicated to me our hearts were pretty slippery. We don't even always know what we mean by something. So it's going to take some work. To admit the problem of self-deception is pretty hard. We're naturally defensive. We're naturally self-promoting. So it's going to take some real reflection to improve our communication problems. One of the things that the Bible, and I think James is picking up on this, is that, well, you better examine your heart because God is going to. The other part of Jeremiah 17 was the heart is deceptive above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? The next verse is, I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, even to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his doings. So we ought to realize it's not just our evaluation of the heart that we, admittedly sometimes too easily justify ourselves. We need to realize it's God's verdict that ultimately counts. In 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul, makes a statement. I don't even judge myself. And his thought is that he doesn't ever judge himself. The thought is his judgment isn't final. He knows that just because he says he's right doesn't mean he is. That God ultimately is the one who judges. And so he reserves the final judgment, realizing that he's going to stand before the Lord. So how do we get a handle on our words? Well, one, we can ask the people around us. We can ask our wife, how do I communicate? What do you hear when I communicate? We can ask our children. Sometimes our wife and our wives and our children are, all too ready to tell us. Here's what you mean. Another thing that I think that helps is that if we're concerned about this, and maybe we're thinking about something, you can write out what you want to say to somebody. And you put it aside for like a week or two, and then you come back and you read it. And hopefully maybe you're calmer when you go back and read. Sometimes you can be surprised. Is that what I sounded like? Or even to record, to get the video camera and record something that you're saying, and then not something obviously public distribution, dangerous these times with Wi-Fi and not always realizing when you're broadcasting. But that is kind of the point here, right? Be so careful that imagine you're broadcasting something, and so some self-evaluation to get a handle on your words can be helpful. So James says that the way we speak to God is pretty good. Verse 9, with it we bless our God and Father. So he's saying, you're not totally clueless about communication here. he said, you know, when I come to your church and I listen to you talk, I listen to you pray, I listen to your singing, I listen to your testimonies, and you do great. You think great thoughts about God, and you're able to say them. So there's something about the understanding of God that helps people to speak well. That when they're talking about God, somehow this speech is able to be elevated. So he's asking us to consider, you know, how do you speak about God? And I think the point is that God deserves honor. So of course we speak well of God. Consider the honor that God deserves. Consider that He deserves praise, and we know that He deserves praise. And we would never consciously use demeaning words about God. Not a conscientious Christian wouldn't do that for sure. So consider the honor that God deserves and how we tend to speak about God. And then I believe what his point is, let the light of that glory shine in our conversation. Imagine the light of God's glory, His honor, His dignity, His royalty shine upon us in our conversation, that it might be helpful to stir up our conscience, to make us very reflective about the words that we use. Maybe you've seen Disney's Lion King. I think it might be in both original animated and the semi-animated, whatever the new one is, kind of mixture of CGI and reality. But anyway, I think in both movies, there's this scene where the young lion cub is somewhere he really shouldn't be, and these hyenas are surrounding him and his companion, female companion. Don't know their girlfriend, but they probably are, but they just don't want to admit it. So anyway, these hyenas are coming around and they're threatening them and they're mocking them. They are, they're moving in and they're just demeaning them, and it is a pretty dangerous situation. And lo and behold, all of a sudden what happens is the father of the lion cub, who is the Lion King, big, fierce, comes up behind. And the speech of all these hyenas drastically changes. When they see the great lion, all of a sudden they become humble, and they're like, oh, we didn't know you were the son of the king. And it's interesting how the glory of the big lion changed the speech of those, because it was kind of this respect. I think that's what James is saying here. Let the light of God's countenance or God's glory shine upon this conversation. Let it be in your mind that it's being broadcast to his ears. He knows, he hears what this is. So we ought to practice the presence of God in all of our life, but maybe especially in conversations at home or conversations abroad, that we practice the presence of God. We imagine the great king standing behind his servants or his children, and to remember that. Heard a story once of a well-known evangelist, highly respected evangelist, who was in a church. And there was a couple in the church that was having really severe problems. And they asked this evangelist if they could meet with him after the service, and they did. And they sat down, and the couple said the wife just is always using harsh words and always getting angry at the husband, and it goes on, and the husband's like, yeah, she's really hard on me. And the evangelist started pressing, and says, is this true? And yeah, it's true. And he began to kind of get on the attack. You mean you are disobeying the Bible? And you mean you are spiritually self-deceived? And on he went, and this went on for 45 minutes to an hour. And finally she broke down in humility and say, yes, sir, I just can't control my tongue. And he said, I've been insulting you for 45 minutes now, and you haven't lost your temper one single time. You are perfectly able to control your tongue when you want to, when you have a respect. And I think that's kind of what James is saying here is, remember who is behind, who is present, who is in this conversation. It might be easy to, to change our ways if we had more of the fear of the Lord in every situation. So, his point then is, if this is true of the Creator, that we ought to speak with grace, which we do, what about the ones created in his image? Again, verse 9, with it, our tongue, we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who've been made in the similitude or the likeness of God. That we've been made in God's image, or another way to put it is God's image bearers, to reflect God's glory. God's the sun, we're the moon. We don't have self-glory, but we have a reflective glory of God, of God's majesty. We are kings and queens upon the earth, and we ought to treat each other that way. C.S. Lewis, in his little article in one of his books called The Weight of Glory, is talking about this fact that everyone we meet has been made in God's image, and he says, you've never met a mere mortal. That everyone you meet is endowed with regal splendor, with a divine spark in some respects. This image of God that is a mystery to us to totally explain, but surely deserves respect and reverence. So we have to consider this anomaly of speaking well of God, but not speaking well or very well to his image bearers. So he's challenging us to perceive God's glory in others, to perceive God in others, to perceive that image, that likeness of God, that representation of God in others. If we had an ambassador from another country come to us, our country, we would want to be very careful that we treated them with respect. We don't want them to go back to their country and report some harsh thing. We don't want our representatives to be treated poorly because they represent more than just themselves. And so God is represented in each and every person, and we ought to have an awareness of that image in others. So one of James' principles that is just a good life principle is to slow down. And not just slow, but get under control. To, when you're upset or when you're in some kind of argument or something, your mind rages, your races, your blood pressure, your blood starts pumping faster, your heart's pumping faster, and you want to go too fast. So he's urging, let everyone be slow to speak, to be in control, to be manageable, to not be in a place where something slips out without much thought. And I think the point is, in terms of Christianity, is to let grace control. If Jesus' atoning work, if his death upon the cross is truly a remedy for sin, and if rejection of that produces the justness of hell, how do we need to improve on it? How could we improve on it? That either the person can be bathed with grace or they're going to face the judgment of God. What can we do that's going to be better than that? Well, what can we do that's going to outdo that? It's not as if God's going to treat someone unfairly. He's going to either forgive their sins and shower them with the kindness of Christ, or he's going to judge them perfectly. So we need to let that thought of grace control, that we don't need to fix everybody, or we don't need to bring judgment upon everybody. It's not like we never have an appropriateness for legal justice in the system, or even church discipline, but it's something that is guided by the pointing towards grace. If someone's in grace and cleaving to grace, then they deserve our favor. Someone's under the judgment of God, we respectfully call them to that, to that reality. But letting grace dominate it is so important. A fourth thing I believe would be a valid principle here, and it's the idea of slow to speak but quick to listen. is the basic thought is that when we are in conflict, we want to express ourselves more than we want to understand. We easily misunderstand others. We easily misjudge others because we are, we're upset, we're self-sensitive, and we feel our own pains readily. We don't feel the pains of others very readily. So one of our tasks is to put ourselves in the other person's shoes, to adapt their sensitivity, to figure out what are they thinking, and enhance communication by sharing that unity. We can understand each other. We're more likely to be good in our communication towards them. 1 Corinthians 13:7 says that love believes all things, which I've mentioned many times. That phrase just befuddles me a little bit, because the Bible clearly says you shouldn't believe everything. There's a lot of things that you should reject. So what does it mean when it says love believes all things? I think it basically means don't be suspicious. Don't be hyper suspicious. Don't assume the worst. Don't look for some reason to be offended. Don't look for some way to give a harsh response because you think you know someone. We have the tendency to judge ourselves by our best intentions and to judge others by what we suspect are the worst intentions. It's not really a fair way to judge. So we should, when in some tension with family or brothers or whoever, assume the best. Assume that and if we were them, we might wrestle, not that they're sinless, but we might understand better where sins come from, or why someone handle things the way that they do. Too brief of a phrase, but assume the superiority of the other. Here, I don't mean they're superior to you in every way. What I mean is they're probably superior to you in some way. No matter how skilled you are, no matter how wise you are, somebody else knows something that you don't know. And you could benefit from it. You could benefit from it. Maybe a child might know something that you don't know. And so to think that we only need judgment upon them is to misunderstand the fact that almost everybody in your life, no matter how irritating they might be to you, can help you in some way. So why offend your teacher? Why alienate the one that could really be a blessing to you? Who knows what it could be. But if you assume that in some respect they are superior to you, you'll have a better attitude towards them. There's something that if you speak to them just right, they might just spill the beans and you might be smarter. But if you just are going to lay out the word and let them have it, then you miss the chance to take advantage of something they know that you could have learned from. Seventh kind of tip here is to practice what you might call mirroring. That is, show your understanding of someone's position by repeating it back to them in a way that they would say, that's exactly right, and I hadn't put it that well myself. To be so understanding of someone that you so echo their position that, basically in communication, one person's saying something, the other person isn't listening, the other person says something, the other person isn't listening, and on it goes, and the temperature goes up, and nothing good happens. But if you can rephrase their position in a way, even if you don't fully agree with it, at least you can express it in a way that if they could say, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, you can greatly improve your communication with others, getting clarification about what someone's position is, and show it by the practice of mirroring, not parroting. Not parroting, because that's kind of offensive. If you say exactly the same thing, it sounds like you're mocking them. But if you put it in your own words and in a thoughtful way that you're respecting it, then you make the other person know you're respecting them. Just like you would If you're standing before a judge, you mean, Judge, this is what you're saying? And you would want to put it in the most gracious, complimentary ways, or you're going to be in trouble. So that's, other people are kings and judges, so practice good mirroring of repeating what they believe. And then finally, to cultivate speech as if you're always speaking to royalty. It's not that kings are always right. It's just you are always careful when you speak to them. God has his image in people, and so that makes people kings and queens, or princes and princesses. And because you know how important somebody is, because you know their position is so exalted, even if you think the king is wrong, you sure want to find some way to say it that doesn't insult them, if you can. Now, that's kind of the skill of the court jester, right? The court jester tries to figure out some way that I need to correct them, but I need to do it in a way that I don't lose my head. You know, that I'm still, standing at the end of this. And so a good court jester figures out some way to compliment the king while still making him laugh at his faults. So that's the way you have to speak to kings, and that's the way we have to speak to others, to find ways to cultivate speech as if to royalty. And if we can keep that in mind, then James will be happier with our communication, and God will be more happy with our carefully chosen, crafted words that honor him while we honor his image bearers. Well, those are big challenges, aren't they? So easy to trip up, and so often we need repentance and confession and forgiveness. But the ideal and the goal is there, and a Christian speech ought to be modeling a life of wisdom. Well, thanks for joining us on our live stream, and thanks for joining us here. We're going to break from this and move to a time of taking some prayer requests and then praying. So if you could change over to our Zoom meeting, we'll see you there in a few minutes. Thanks for joining us. Have a good night.